You like that? Do you need a little bit more, or it's good like that? A little bit more? Okay, then that's the Pegel now, and we can check the catch box too, how the Pegel does. So, and this one, I guess should be fine, or yes. So, yeah, okay, cool. All right.
Thanks so much. Sorry?
Oh no, that's okay. Nee, weiß ich auch nicht, aber warte mal, das muss, dann lass mal weitergehen. Kann man die direkt vom Haus abrufen, wie das ja, klar. Ja, hab ich gerade.
Sorry about that. In my mind, I had, but I don't know where it was.
Siitä oli jotain.
Sketch
tai jotain tästä. Ja toivomme, että vähän ainakin sitten tyhjentää ne puolet. Voi varmaan jakaa.
No sitä suuremmalla kyllä samalla.
Aivan, joo.
Sehän kiinnostaa.
I'm a soccer player and his presentation. Yeah. I received it. Yeah.
What, just one second?
You had so busy.
So hard.
I see your latest email.
Nämä on nämä kiertävät. Se voi periaatteessa myös heittää. No, mutta jos sä lähdet niin riittävällä, niin kyllä se sinne. Mä voin olla. Anteeksi, onko teidän esitys
Anyway, so we'll just be there after they are making something.
Tässä on puoliväli, eihän siellä saa mitään aikaiseksi, niin se kertoo vaan sitä, mitä siihen ympäriin.
Lite mer exakt igen den gången med att ha med
Are your presentations in the desktop or where?
Ska vi ta med
No, you might want to wind them up and get them out.
I inherited it from Ken. Should we also have the Nordic, the general one? Put it inside?
Maybe one is enough.
The one after the one inside?
Yeah. It would be hard. Yeah, I like it. I worked by a new one, see one size, like sit in there, I think 13. Joo, tulkaa vaan.
Just one or two.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Hi, I'm Juliana, side events assistant. Are you going to switch the slides? Are you going to proceed here, the slides, the PowerPoint presentation?
And I only
In fact, what is your organization?
Ministry of Finance.
Okay.
Ministry of Finance. Indonesia.
So I just mentioned it in the introduction that you are the partners cooperating in this. I will mention the right organization.
Very well.
Yeah, I just want to ask you to leave the Google Chrome open because we are broadcasting this event. If you close any of this, it's going to stop immediately the broadcast, which is live now at the YouTube. And in case of the questions, this is a catch box to throw, and people need to speak directly here, otherwise the audio is not going to be recorded. It's
But when somebody wants to ask something, they have to.
and you can speak directly here, not
But like it. Okay. What are these microphones? I have to switch them on.
And you don't have to do something that they want to find.
Oh, it's. Okay. All right.
It was great, but it was
Do you have any kind of remote? Where's the system? Or is it easier when the speaker actually comes here and changes him or herself? Is it easy like that? That I just, give this. It's possible, or is it nicer than you?
I prefer to do it myself, but perhaps it's just me.
What about you? Okay. I mean, no, you cannot. So it's, but we can leave this spot empty, or I can, take the chair in the front.
There is something. Okay, and I think, yeah. It's useful to icon bookmark the page.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah. Wow. That is through it. Yeah. It's a short time. When you throw, the sound is kind of blocked. So it only works when people going to speak. It's very cool. Okay. So put it here. I can give it to the language.
Okay, so the chair asks you to introduce yourself. And then Laura. So do you change the slides yourself, because I can, leave it empty for you to sit here and.
So we're gonna swap into where we're sitting. Each person will come and sit here.
I think it's easier.
Okay, let's do that. Okay.
Laura, could you, Laura, the backdrop.
Tosi pohjoismainen tilaisuus. Ihmiset ajoissa ja istuu kuin kirkossa.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the side event. This side event is about scaling up green energy finance, swapping fossil fuel subsidies for sustainable energy solutions. My name is Anna Laitinen, and I'm coordinator of the Nordic Council of Ministers Working Group for the Global Climate Negotiations. And it's an honor to welcome you on behalf of Nordic countries to this side event, which is co-arranged together with the Nordic Council of Ministers, International Institute of Sustainable Development, IISD, Gaia Consulting, and the Ministry of Energy, Utilities and Climate of Denmark, and also Ministry of Finance of Indonesia. The Nordic Council of Ministers has supported several projects enhancing the SWIFT from fossil fuels to sustainable energy resources and reallocation of investments from fossil fuels to low carbon solutions. Successful Nordic cost-efficient solutions could, through upscaling, lead to significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions globally. I look forward to hear the results and recommendations from the latest projects on Nordic Green to Scale, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and mobilizing climate finance flows, and most importantly, the country case from Indonesia. This side event today is about already ended projects, but I'm happy to tell you that Nordic work on reducing fossil fuel subsidies continues. Nordic countries have launched the Prime Minister's initiative called Nordic Solutions to Global Challenges, which is about sharing Nordic lessons from flagship projects called Nordic Sustainable Cities, Nordic Gender Effect, and Nordic Green to Scale. Also, the further work on fossil fuel subsidy reform continues under this initiative. I hope to receive valuable input from you, comments and questions after the presentations. They will be really valuable and taking into account into the new follow-up project on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And last but not the least, I remind about the catering, which is available afterward outside the meeting room. I hope that you enjoyed the side event, and now I will give the floor to the chair, Karoliina Anttonen.
Right. Thank you, Anna, and dear colleagues. Also, you're most welcome on my behalf as well to this side event on scaling up green energy finance. I'm from Finland, which is part of this project, and I work as a lawyer at the Environment Ministry there. I do have a background at the Energy Department as well, so I have, so to say, first-hand experience on various subsidies on energy field as well. And we have a very impressive panel here presenting today. I'm very pleased to have everybody here. And we're going to start with the introduction to the topic by Mr. Hans Jacob Eriksen from Denmark. And that will be followed by Laura. And I would ask everybody to briefly introduce themselves and maybe their background organizations before moving on to their presentations. Thank you. Hans Jacob.
Yes, this one.
Well, good late morning, everyone. Good to see a nearly full room. As already introduced, I'm Hans Jacob Eriksen from the Danish Ministry of Energy, Utilities and Climate. We are basically here today to launch a new report financed by the Nordic Council of Ministers, making the switch or scaling up green energy finance, swapping fossil fuel subsidies for sustainable energy solutions. With this slide, I'm basically launching the report, so consider it hereby done. I just learned that it's at the moment only available online, but you can get more information on that, I'm sure, on the stand that the Nordic Council of Ministers has here in Bonn. I just passed it on the way to the room here. A brief overview of what is motivating at least me or Denmark to join this agenda, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of the Nordic countries also. So a little bit of background and going into the subject in a helicopter perspective, you can say. 2003, the IEA pointed to the benefits of energy efficiency in a special report, of which a part was also addressing fossil fuel subsidy reform, saying that energy efficiency measures totally put together could contribute nearly half of the necessary emission reductions in the short term. And as you see here on the slide, we have fossil fuel subsidies reform could contribute with around 12%. And this picture somehow, yeah, I'll jump to the next here. Because this has, at least from the Danish side, made us think, okay, energy efficiency has a big untapped potential. Fossil fuel subsidy reform is part of it. Further to our motivation is the heading here, Big Data, a modern title, but basically is to show that we are looking at very big opportunities, both in terms on the financial side and also on the climate mitigation side. And Laura from the IISD will have me excused because I put in slightly not fully updated numbers on what the fossil fuel subsidy reform means in financial terms. It here says $490 billion a year is provided in fossil fuel subsidy reform, fossil fuel subsidies, and this is based on 2014 numbers. So there's an update on that, but this is basically because I'm combining the numbers here with the subsidies that is provided for renewable energy and private sector investments in energy efficiency. And this was how the numbers looked in 2014 or 15. But this basically says there's a big, if we can somehow convert the subsidies to more meaningful, to us more meaningful investments in renewables or energy efficiency, then there's a big opportunity here. And I guess based partly on these data, the ISD conducted analysis that is also reflected in one of the reports from the Nordic Council of Ministers, saying that if we took just a portion of the fossil fuel subsidies, around 30%, and redirected these funding into investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency, we could go from the 11 or the 10 to 12% in mitigation up to 18%. So fossil fuel subsidy reform and using the saved subsidies within the energy sector can increase mitigation ambition. This looks very interesting to us. And in these calculations, we have not encountered co-benefits, clean air, better health, whatever. So to the point, and as I also alluded to, I mean, this is the quote from the report, where the IISD has found that if we take part of the fossil fuel subsidy, fossil fuel subsidies and redirect them into renewables or energy efficiency measures, we can actually increase our mitigation potential. So how do we do it? The switch or the swap? And this is a glimpse into an ideal world. So you should maybe take a photo of this slide, because it's very seldom that you get to look into the ideal world. But basically what I've shown here is that we have fossil fuel subsidies at the top. We will remove them. We will somehow we will try to, it's not possible to ring fence these funds directly, but we will look at the amount of financing that is sort of freed up or saved, and how can they be reallocated into energy efficiency or renewables, either investments or at least incentive schemes or measures. And this should, by the end of the day, leave, you can say, the end user more or less unharmed. So they will be looking at the same energy bill, because now they've improved in energy efficiency. We will have saved CO2 emission reductions and so forth. And a small note on this is that the opportunity to undertake such exercise, we've also considered is very feasible at the moment, because we're looking at comparable low oil price at the moment. So this is also to say that we want to sustain the reform, so to say. We want to sustain taking back the subsidies and using them for sustainable energy purposes, because should the oil price go up again, then we are somehow disconnected from this development. Some governments might be inclined, if they see the oil price go up, to reinforce subsidies again. And we want to secure that the funding remains in a sustainable energy future. But this is an ideal world, but it's basically what we're trying to promote. So the heading here, what's in it for me and for all of us? Well, we're saving inefficient subsidies. There will be freed up funds for sustainable energy and enhanced climate mitigation. We are leveling the playing field for clean energy investments, aligning fiscal incentive for clean energy and climate mitigation with INDC plans and targets. And as I mentioned, the oil price is low at the moment, so we see an enhanced opportunity to go down this road. This brings me to my final point, that the Nordic Council of Ministers has actually issued a number of reports that relates to this subject. One is directly on learning from leading countries undertaking fossil fuel subsidy reform, but also on green financing the Nordic ways and promoting climate finance investments. And I'm alluding to these publications, and I think they're actually available outside here in hard copies, but otherwise you can visit the NORN homepage. But it's just to say that we need to move, we see it quite important. We see the fossil fuel subsidy piece as moving into national fiscal policies, you can say. And I think it's important for developing countries also to move in a direction where we are, you can say, not subsidizing the wrong things, but giving incentives to the right things. And there's still a lot of work to do. And one final note from my end is also, I mean, if we talk to Danish institutional investors and say, why don't you go into developing countries and finance big scale renewable or energy efficiency interventions? They allude to also that there are still risks on long-term pricing, the right incentives. Can they get there? Is their price fixed for 20-year horizon on selling electricity to the grid and so forth? And the Nordic countries actually has a lot to contribute on this agenda, and I think it's worthwhile digging into some of these reports. So with that, I'll leave the stage Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans Jakob. When you presented your graph of the ideal world, it seemed to make perfect sense. And I guess my only question at this point is, why isn't this being done already? But maybe Laura Merrill, who will be presenting next, will go a little bit further into the topic. Laura, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm Laura Merrill. I'm from the Global Subsidies Initiative, which is part of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. They're the people who provide the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, and you see a lot of around these sorts of events. At GSI, the Global Subsidies Initiative, we're around 15 staff and associates, and we work on fossil fuel subsidies. And we work with country partners, and we work on the smooth reform of these subsidies across around 10 countries. And our work, which is a lot of research, but also working very closely with governments and partners, can be found at this website here on the slide. And we're very lucky to be here today, working with the Nordic Council of Ministers to launch a project which we've been working on for a number of years now, called Making the Switch, which is essentially about swapping fossil fuel subsidies for sustainable energy investments. So I would encourage you to take a look at this new report. It's basically a primer on fossil fuel subsidies. It talks about the scale of the subsidies upstream to producers and downstream to consumers for 2015, which is a quite significant 425 billion. And it takes a look at the impact of these subsidies on the Sustainable Development Goals. It covers the issues around fiscal space in the economy and how subsidies create a drag on the economy, and how removing them creates the fiscal space for governments to do other things with that money. It talks about the opportunity costs that are lost from governments missing out from investing this money in other areas of the economy, like sustainable energy or education or health. It also links to the very regressive nature of these subsidies. They often don't benefit poor people, and they're an incredibly poor way of targeting welfare to poor people, because the benefits of these subsidies are captured by the rich. But not only that, many governments in the process of reform have put in more sophisticated welfare systems that target cash to poor people instead of offering cheap fossil fuels. For example, in the Philippines, but there are lots of examples in this report. It talks about the link with health and air pollution, the link with women, how women are not benefiting necessarily from these subsidies. And finally, it talks about the link to climate change and renewables and energy efficiency takeoff. So if you're interested in the SDGs, then there are very few measures around for funding this broad sweep of asks. Countries should look carefully at removing fossil fuel subsidies. And I will just go through here. This is what Hans Jakob Eriksson was mentioning, and I'm going to focus on a few here, but the main reason we're here is to talk about sustainable energy and the sustainable energy transition and financing that. And there's a lot of talk of how to do this with private finance, and private finance is incredibly important, but government finance is needed and government regulations are needed to leverage the private finance necessary, as Denmark explained. And that's got to be about shifting the incentives and the subsidies from fossil fuels towards sustainable energy to make this happen. The World Bank estimate it will cost around $1 trillion to make this transition each year. Now, fossil fuel subsidies represent about half the budget for this clean energy transition, to double renewables, to double the improvement in energy efficiency, and to get access to energy for everyone. And at the moment, this figure is 6 times more than what was pledged at Paris for climate finance. So it's currently 22 times more than the amount of money we're spending as governments on adaptation financing. So the thing is, there is a huge opportunity here, and it has to be a redirection of these funds, a divestment, if you like, of government funds away from fossil fuels and towards sustainable energy. So we come to the main reason why we're here in Bonn, following up on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And this is to do with climate change, because removing these subsidies will have energy emissions reductions. This is from an earlier report. We estimated from across just 20 countries against business as usual, this would be about 3 gigatons by 2020. There are very few tools that governments can use to save money and abate emissions, but this is one of them, with savings of around $93 per ton. The emissions over all these 20 countries go from 11% with the removal of the fossil fuels down to around 18% with this investment into renewables and energy efficiency, as we've mentioned before, and this is the graph that brings all these countries together. This report went through a review of 20 studies on the impact of fossil fuel subsidy removal and finds a 6 to 8% reduction by 2050. Some studies find very significant impacts from previous and ongoing subsidies in the past. For example, in 2010, a world without subsidies would have had carbon emissions 36% lower than they actually were. So this is about thinking about the past, but also how much reductions we could get in the future. But the point is, it's not just about removing the subsidies. Removing the subsidies, as Denmark have explained, will level the energy playing field, but it's about switching these subsidies into sustainable energy. Not even all of them, just a very modest 30%. And that will bring about further emissions reductions. And each of these swaps will have to be very practical and thought through by governments and the private sector together. For example, we're talking about massive subsidies to diesel and gasoline going into public transport systems, huge subsidies every year going to diesel fuel that could be going into solar panels or solar pumps, kerosene subsidies that are used for lighting. Perhaps we could think about having solar light systems and solar subsidies. So the report provides outlines from Nordic examples, because this is not a new thing. The Nordics have been doing this for a long time, and this is the point about learning from other countries and leapfrogging, with investment in heat pumps, electric vehicles and wind, and over time removal of subsidies and reviews of subsidies to remove subsidies to fossil fuels. 4 roadmaps are outlined with swaps, and we'll hear from one of the countries where a swap is outlined, Indonesia. I'm very happy to have Kindi on the panel, so that's great. But other swaps are outlined for Bangladesh, Morocco and Zambia, and they're very practical. The concepts are linked to switching diesel and butane subsidies to solar pumps in the agricultural sector, switching fossil fuel subsidies to energy efficiency, especially within industries, for example, the mining sector in Zambia or the garment sector in Bangladesh. More generally, the coal subsidies that are still out there, switching them to renewables. And in general as well, switching fossil fuel subsidies to targeted cash transfer programs. I mean, this is also has to happen as well as an investment in the sustainable energy system, because governments have been providing welfare and benefits through cheap fuels, gasoline and diesel, to drive cars, and the switch needs to be to more targeted social protection systems and a just transition for protection of the poor, and also for protection of workers who have been previously working in this fossil fuel industry. And this is really what the whole side event is about, creating the level playing field, or the fair playing field, for sustainable energy, fossil fuel subsidy reform, plus this correct energy pricing. Potentially, governments can then think about VAT and carbon tax. With this strong signals to markets and reliable regulation, will create this level energy playing field to get this investment needed for this energy transition. There will be emissions reductions from the reforms themselves, but with further investment, with a swap into renewables and energy efficiency, there will be long-term emissions reductions and further emissions reductions beyond the reform itself. And this will help us to help fund things like green to scale, which we'll hear about in a minute, and get this moving.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. And indeed, as you pointed out, in Finland, we do have certain, clean energy subsidies that we have applied. So we have decreased tax rates for electric vehicles. We have tax reductions for household heat pumps, and we have a feed-in tariff for wind power. So we have taken some of these measures that you mentioned in your report to use. But I also want to be honest, there's still a lot to do also in terms of I believe, all Nordic countries' subsidy policy. It's not perfect, and the discussion concerning, for example, energy-intensive industry subsidies is ongoing. We do have a subsidy system for like energy innovations in industry in place in Finland. But to go to other countries' experiences, I'm very pleased to present Mr. Kindi Arsiarir, who comes from Indonesia and will share their experiences. Kindi, please.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I also would like to thank IISD and the Nordic Council of Ministers for having Indonesia on the panel today. Yes, I would like to share our experience in reforming our fuel subsidies. Maybe as you all aware, back in the January of 2015, for the first time, the government has been successful to reform the fuel subsidies. Before the reform, fuel subsidy took up the budget until I think 35% of the budget allocations for the fuel subsidies. And following the reform at the year of 2015, the subsidy decreased immediately, only about a quarter of what it was to be. And now it's only about 1/10 of it was used to be. Well, it's been very, very good exercise for policy at that time, because we actually, Ministry of Finance has tried to do that 4 years before. But of course, because of the structure of the economy itself, it's very, very hard to get the reform moving. And now with the additional 35% of the budget suddenly available, then we can allocate that for better allocation. Like for instance, the renewables infrastructures for energy, the green infrastructures, and health development, and also for the educations and other social programs. And with this, I think we also are very keen to move forward with the reform. Like for instance, we already now remove the subsidy for the electricity. We now only have subsidy for very little portion of the economy, only for those who consume less than 900 watts hour per month. That will be a very poor household, if you like. So with this in place, we really looking forward as well to reduce our greenhouse gases emission intensity with respect to the economy. As you all aware, maybe before the reform, the ratio of the development of the GDP towards the electricity demand is more than 1%. Now it is closer to about 1. So this is, I think, a good development. Where from the NDC of Indonesia, first to achieve the target of 29% unilateral effort by 2030, 17% of it will come from the agriculture, forestry, and land use. And then second, the 12% will come from the energy sectors. And I can share with you that of our exercise at the Bureau of our Development, National Development Planning, the 7% of it will come from the energy efficiency. So I think this is also a very good point. Maybe for the next 2 years, we could somehow try to move the policy toward energy efficiencies, because rather than generating energy efficiency will have shorter time for achieving the target of the NDCs. And out of the renewable energy, as you all aware, Indonesia, I think, is the second largest of the geothermal energy potentials. But of course, because of the location of the potential well that is most of the time are out of the grid, it also becoming very expensive to develop this the grid. But in the Indonesia electrical power plan, we already embed the target of having 31% of the renewable energy into the national energy mix by 2050 and having 23% by 2030. And compared to current composition of about 13%, I think this is a very ambitious plan, which I think will be able to be financed through the reformation of the fossil fuel subsidies. So I think I would like to close my sharing here, and I will take on the question and answer later on. Thank you, Karen. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Kindi. And I'm glad you pointed out that subsidy reform actually can be a great potential for NDC implementation, and also thanks for pointing out the other co-benefits, such as being able to direct more funds to education and other social programs. Next, as a speaker, we have Mr. Oras Tynkkynen from the Finnish Innovation Fund, and he'll be talking about diverting fossil subsidies to climate investment. Oras, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So my name is Oras Tynkkynen, and I currently serve as a senior advisor to the Finnish Innovation Fund, SITRA. But I've been working on climate and energy policy for about 20 years in different roles, including as a member of parliament and attending 17 conferences of parties over the years. I'm going to be very Finnish in the presence of so many fellow Finns and Nordics, so I'm going to dive straight into the topic. But I'm just going to share the reports I'm going to talk about. I have sample copies here, so if you can please help me here and distribute them, you can have a look. And before you go out, there are also brochures outside. So when you are enjoying the catering, you can also read the brochures. The Green to Scale project has been trying to answer a fairly simple question, which is how far can we go as the world community in tackling the climate crisis simply using what we already know and what we already have. And to operationalize that question for the analysis, we have been looking at how much we could reduce emissions if we were able to replicate the successes of some countries. So in essence, scaling up existing climate solutions of various kinds by 2030 to the extent that some countries have already achieved today. And the results have been, I would say, very exciting and inspiring. We found that in the first report we launched 2 years ago that simply scaling up a selection of 17 existing solutions, both from the global north and the global south, would be enough to deliver emission reductions of about 1/4 by 2030 compared to current global emission levels. So we are talking about extremely significant emission reduction simply scaling up something other countries have already achieved today. Last year, we released another report focusing on 15 Nordic solutions, and in that report, we found that scaling up these solutions to comparable countries would deliver emission reductions by 2030 equal to the current total emissions of the European Union. So again, very significant emission reductions simply scaling up existing solutions. We have also found that these solutions are surprisingly affordable, and I would argue much more affordable than most people perhaps realize. And as has been referenced earlier in the previous presentations, they would also provide very significant co-benefits to people and the environment. So they make a whole lot of sense from the point of view of our societies. I would very much encourage you to have a look at these reports and other material on the project website. What I'm going to focus today here is to just give you perhaps a flavor, a couple of examples of what kind of achievements, climate investments we could be making, diverting just a fraction of the fossil fuel subsidies we have today. And I'm going to give you 5 examples based on our studies so far. We looked at wind power, and we all know that Denmark has been one of the leading countries in that regard. Assuming that other countries were able to achieve a similar share of their respective wind power potentials by 2030, as Denmark has already achieved today, that would deliver emission reductions of more than 1 gigaton in 2030, which is equal to the total emissions of the UK and France combined. Now, how much would that cost? We are talking about very significant emission reductions here. The total cost would, in 2030, be equal to about 1 month of global direct fossil fuel subsidies today. And let me just underline that we are talking about direct fossil fuel subsidies. If we included indirect fossil fuel subsidies as defined by, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, obviously that money would take us even further. So a fraction of direct fossil fuel subsidies would be enough to finance the investment to wind power, delivering these massive emission reductions. Colombia is one of the countries that has been very successful in introducing bus rapid transit. If that experience were scaled up to big cities in emerging economies, by 2030 we could reduce global emissions by as much as Norway produces today. And the price? Just 11 hours of fossil fuel subsidies today. So a microscopic fraction of fossil fuel subsidies would be enough to deliver this kind of emission reduction. And not only that, it would mean a major improvement in the livability of many big cities across the world. China, the leading country when it comes to introducing improved cook stoves, if that success were to be scaled up to other countries, by 2030 we could cut global emissions by about 1 gigaton again. And the price, just 9 days of fossil fuel subsidies today. So extremely affordable compared with the massive benefits that this kind of investment would have, not only on climate, but also on the health of millions of people, especially in the global south. Another example from China, China has been quite successful in improving energy efficiency in various industries. Again, if these achievements were to be replicated in comparable countries, significant emission reductions at the price of just 24 days of current fossil fuel subsidies. And finally, one example from the forestry and agriculture sector. Many of you will know that Costa Rica has been extremely successful in afforesting and reforesting lands through its payment for ecosystem services program. Massive emission reductions, again, achievable by 2030, around 900 megatons, with just the price of 13 days of current fossil fuel subsidies. This is just to give you a flavor, a couple of illustrative examples of what kind of climate investments we could be making if we were able to divert at least part of the current fossil fuel subsidies. To sum up, scaling up existing climate solutions, no new technologies required, would cut global emissions significantly. This climate investment could, at least in part, be financed by diverting funds from fossil fuel subsidies. And then on a very practical note, the Green to Scale project is going to continue this year and next year. And what we are going to do is to take this approach, this type of analysis, but to focus on individual countries. So if any of you are interested in trying to understand the potential of existing climate solutions in your countries or countries you work in, please come and talk to me after this. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Oras, very much for your indeed very finish, to the point and time-efficient presentation. I think this made a perfect case of the fact that just a partial subsidy reform could mean a lot in terms of directing investment to clean energy. Next on my list, I have Mr. Mikko Halonen from Gaia Consulting, who will continue on the topic of climate finance.
Thank you, dear colleagues and friends. I tried to stand up so that I could see all this beautiful crowd. So I'm very happy to be with this distinguished panel here and see lots of people who probably will be making the change. And then I also see some senior experts like Jürgen Fennam, from whom I have had the chance to learn a lot during the last years. Instead of wasting your time on presenting where I come from or Gaia, I will do it the other way. I will present a couple examples of our work that relates to the topic today. We work with microfinance institutions, for instance, in different parts of the world during the last 20 years. Microfinance, we try to combine finance and energy solutions. And there are subsidy reform ongoing in Ethiopia. And when we are working there, we really have to carefully see what is happening in the country in order to succeed with our work on microfinance. In Tanzania, we are trying to establish companies who can, on a sustainable business basis, address some of the deforestation issues. Again, this requires that you understand the playing field and also work with switch on or switch off issues constantly. We've been looking at how to turn remittance flows, for instance, in Bolivia into something that would be greener. I will come to this. This will be one of my takeaway points in the end of my presentation. And then on the other hand, during the last 20 years, we have tried to help different development finance institutions to assess their developmental impacts, but also green and make their investments climate compatible. Like my distinguished colleagues have mentioned, the Nordic countries are working a lot on these topics. And these are just a few examples of the work that we have had the pleasure to participate in during the past years. And the reports are available. Hopefully they will be useful to all of you. Now I will try to come to my key points, and I will conclude with 3 suggestions. Hopefully you will challenge them. The Nordic countries, we have tried to identify what the Nordic countries could do, what could be their value added. And if we look at where we are currently with climate finance and with the public climate finance, we know that it's limited. It's this small red dot representing it here in this picture. So that finance needs to be used extremely well, and it connects with the fossil fuel subsidy reform. But at the same time, we need to work on all these other climate finance flows, or to make them actually climate compatible. And while we developed a roadmap for the Nordic countries, this is exactly what we propose to the Nordic governments. Please make sure that while you work with this climate-related ODA, do also take the efforts to look at how to turn around the big boat around it. And these two components need to work in tandem. So a couple final comments and suggestions. The Nordic countries do have certain strengths. It can be institutions, instruments, experience. In many parts of the world, also the Nordic countries are respected for how they work with their partner countries. Denmark mentioned the de-risking issues also. There are good experiences of de-risking investments that could be shared also with other countries. Then, with regards to fossil fuel subsidy reform, I think we should also look at other parts of society, whether we're looking at cholesterol, health reform, or whatever. Rarely do things succeed if we want to do transformations unless we think of both parts of the cycle, like the full life cycle of transformation and policy reform. And here I see a big opportunity of using the lessons learned from Indonesia, Ethiopia, maybe also Nordic countries, of how to do a successful fossil fuel subsidy reform, and make use of those experiences also in transformation generally to climate compatible development. Because we cannot just add on, do new projects without understanding what else needs to be switched, swapped on or off. And thirdly, this might seem self-evident to all of us in this room, but if we look at what is happening with the SDGs, we still have challenges of working in silos. If we look at the private sector, we look at corporate social responsibility work, climate change is only slowly being mainstreamed into what the companies are doing. Look at development finance institutions working on ESG issues. Climate is getting in there, but for instance, the resilience or adaptation aspects still lack proper treatment. So I would encourage all of us to take also seriously the climate mainstreaming aspects to the end, and understand that we cannot waste and doing double work on addressing climate change and SDGs separately. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mikko, for bringing the perspective of international climate finance into the discussion. So here were the presentations of our distinguished panel of speakers, and we have had one request to make an intervention from the floor. So I would like to invite Mr. Stéphane Pouvary to make an intervention. The floor is yours, Stéphane.
Do I really throw it? Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you. And this is clearly a very important event. And I will say, unfortunately, almost each year we have this kind of event. And this decade, we are all comply about these subsidies. Each G20, G7, and almost everywhere, we just repeat figure, and we all know this is very dramatic at the end. So maybe my point here is just to make a clear connection with the work some country has to undertake regarding the improvement of the INDC, the NDC. And because my NGO, Energy 2050, I've been involved in 7 INDC in Africa and 1 in small island states. And when we go back to the financing aspect, we make some analysis in Senegal on cost benefits to some, let's say, mechanism to work on. And I will say, I assume this is among one example of analysis on INDC on cost benefits on measure. And when we go back to implementations, so far, I think we need to explain, not to put some, let's say, advocacy, but to explain how this country can improve their INDC since this, let's say, the approach of subsidies. And I will give you one example. Many of these countries I'm speaking on, when they put in place a legal framework for renewables, they are not, let's say, in line with their spirit and with what they put in their INDC. And it's very strange at the end. And when we try to explain to these people why, and to ask why, the answer is not clear. I will give 2 or 3 examples. Why they don't put in place some feed-in tariff for some large plants. And sometimes they argue because they are losing something, but it makes just something contradictory because they don't improve, let's say, their energy balance. It costs almost nothing. And when we have some good example like in Morocco with the CSP, the cost of equipment and the cost of installation at the end, the cost of the kilowatt hour produced is less than the ones to be produced with subsidies. So when we put figure, project by project, it makes no sense. On another point, also working with subsidies to importation on equipment. And it's very helpful to understand why they don't put in place these kind of things. Go back to Senegal. If you import some equipment, you pay some taxes, you pay no taxes. And if you try to put in place some manufacturers locally based to try to produce wafer, to produce panels, they have some taxes. So something is very strange because this is not direct subsidies like we all have in mind, but something is some schizophrenic approach or how they are going to deal with energy concerns. So my point here is maybe as a Nordic, let's say, Council is very powerful on this issue to try to endorse and to support some governments, but very high level, not technician levels, to try to make them feel and concerned about schizophrenic decisions at their country level, and to reconnect at the end with INDC, because in the long term, we are just going to repeat these figures. And we need now to not only demonstrate it's possible, but to help these people when they go back home, not to fight between ministry and to put something which are just fighting against. And last point, I want also to make the link with energy efficiency. And we have a big concern, for example, in Africa with buildings. And it's very strange because in Africa, it will be more than 40,000 new urban inhabitants per day for the next 2 or 3 decades. And if we compare with the difficulties to put in place some solar panels, some solar heaters, and some biodigester or whatever you decide, at the end, we are going to create locking effect. So if we still continue working to discuss how we can change the global framework, without taking into account this kind of contradiction locally based, I think we are going to make some very worse situation in this country. So because we are now here in Bonn, I think we need to put this kind of, let's say, side events in the upfront. Today, there is a technical expert meeting on, let's say, cross-sectorial approach. And we are not speaking about this kind of issue. And I think it's very important to reconnect not only climate finance, but also the concrete ways that these people who are going to design or to improve the INDC to make them something successful, to make consistent. So this is just my small contribution, but for us, it's a real concern because I'm here also since decade and we are just repeating. And maybe some of you will remind, even it's just in Rio +20, there was a big debate on subsidies. And in the first draft our Brazilian colleagues put on the table, it was something about subsidies. And at the end, they just delayed in the energy paragraph and put at the end to say inefficient subsidies for environment. If somebody is in position to explain what is inefficient subsidies, just try to explain to me. But just to say, we don't need to advocate, we need to educate policymakers in order not to go too far in schizophrenic decision because we don't have time. That's just my small contribution.
All right, thank you very much, Stefan, for your contribution and a call for policy consistency and should I say a warning about creating like contradicting or counterproductive policy instruments. I now open the floor for comments or questions, and I see there's already one request for the floor. Timo Tyrväinen, please. And we've got two of these soft thingies that we can toss around.
Did it. I'm Timo Tyrväinen, Chief Economist of Climate Leadership Council, surprise, surprise, from Finland. So I want to thank for this, I think, very insightful panel. And now when I think about these matters, these financial flows, actually, in a way, there are two main streams there. One is related to what the representative of Gaia said. In private sector, you don't need to invent the wheel again. And the other thing is that you have is the role of government in directing, in a way, kind of public money away from fossil subsidies to something else. So there is a somewhat different logic here between these two things. But first about this private sector, which is where I'm working now. Climate Leadership Council in Finland, it consists of the leading Finnish companies. The stock valuation of these companies is around a half of all the Finnish stock market valuation. There are, in a way, worldwide names like Nokia, Kone, one of the leading elevator producers, all the main energy companies, all main paper producers. And what they share together is that they view that climate change is something which will change the surrounding where they should create their future success as companies. It changes it drastically. And they need to understand what's happening. They need to be prepared. And therefore, for these, and also we have major Finnish banks there, pension funds, innovation fund, SITRA, which is represented by Oras Tynkkynen here. And these, they all see that simply benefits of these private companies, investors, it creates a kind of pressure, or it makes clever, wise to redirect their money towards processes which are actually helping mitigation of climate change. But then when we talk about this government money, I think myself, I have always said that so far until this panel, that hey, we have to get rid of these subsidies for fossil fuels. I think after this panel, I think that one should start to argue, if we have money, if governments think that they have money to subsidize something, is it the best way to subsidize these fossil things? Or should we redirect by using it for purposes which help societies to live better in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, etc.? This is kind of a small change in vocabulary and argumentation, but I think that it could help politicians to rethink these issues seriously. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Timo, for your comment. I see a few requests for the floor, and I would in fact ask anybody who catches the box to take the floor and introduce yourselves briefly and then make your case. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Arturo Valderas, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Economics and Policy of Climate Change in the University of Leeds. I'm working on a project for climate change policy at municipal level in Mexico, and we would love to get involved with some of you to try to adapt some of the results or promote some changes there. And I think there is an elephant in the room that is not mentioned, is that the political economy around the changing in the subsidies generates massive obstacles from the people who is receiving the subsidies right now. So in this context, I would like to ask you, based on the experiences you already had in Indonesia or Ethiopia, what are the real policy options and what are the governance schemes necessary to move forward in developing countries? Because the reality is quite different to what you have in the Nordic countries. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I wonder if, Kindy, you would have a couple of minutes to respond, because I thought the question was very much directed. But I think Kindy has to go to another engagement. So I wonder if, Laura, you would be in a position, and Oras, definitely. Oras, please.
Well, as a former politician, I found the question about the political economy of fossil fuel subsidies extremely important. We all know, I mean, referring back to the first intervention from the floor, that this discussion has been ongoing for decades. We know that removing subsidies makes environmental sense, it makes economic sense, and it makes also social sense, which we sometimes forget, and yet it's not happening. And although many of the discussions here today have been around countries in the global south, I would just like to remind ourselves that there are vast fossil fuel subsidies still remaining in the global north as well, including my own country. And the political economy is just as difficult in these countries. Now, how to address that? I wonder if one of the challenges is that when we gather to these meetings, it is mostly experts and analysts, academics who discuss these issues. Whereas if you go to a government session on the next year's budget, the discussion is going to be, to put it diplomatically, very different and happening on a very different level. So should we do a bit more to interpret these results to the language and the discourse of actual politics as it happens in governments and parliaments? And that is actually something we at the Finnish Innovation Fund SITRA are currently considering. We are considering commissioning a report on how to remove fossil fuel subsidies, not from a research agency and not from an analyst, but from a politician, and to try to come up with a politically realistic pathway out of these fossil fuel subsidies. And just to give you one example of what the political economy can mean in practice, we currently have 3 different parties in the Finnish government, and all of these parties have different priorities in terms of what subsidies they find dear to themselves. So if you want to remove subsidies during this current government, you actually have to look into the policies of each and every government party and each and every minister to understand where you have larger wiggle room for removing subsidies as it is currently the political situation. And then when the government changes, you might have a different route and you might be able to remove different subsidies. But this is just one example of what the political economy can mean in practice.
Laura.
Yeah, it is a shame that Kindy's left, because 35% of a government budget that's freed up because of subsidy reform is not insignificant. So actually, I don't agree that there aren't reforms and there hasn't been progress. And I know perhaps in Senegal, the situation might be difficult, but certainly in Morocco, there's been huge progress. Indonesia saved $15 billion in 2015 and invested it throughout their economy in more productive sectors. India saved $15 billion in 2015 from subsidy reform and have done the same. This year, we've seen, in 2016 and 2017, we've seen around 50 countries reforming. This is policy change that is happening now, and it has been enabled partly because of the low oil price, but partly because there are many more examples of how countries have done this successfully. And GSI have spent many years working both in Indonesia and India at the ground with politicians and partners in Bahasa and in local languages. For example, in 2014, we published a guidebook to fossil fuel subsidy reform on the political economy of fossil fuel subsidy reform, getting energy prices right, building support for reform, and putting in place mitigation measures, all possible to do this in local languages and building cross-party support. So although, and subsidies have come down, a great deal of that is to do with the low oil price, but about sort of 30% to 40% is to do with active reforms. So there is definitely a movement at this level on the political economy, and people getting smarter at understanding this as we develop. Also, I wanted to respond to Stefan on the NDCs. We did research with GIZ in 2015 that shows only 14 countries included FFSR within their NDC. But this is the beginning of this. You know, this is a potential to increase this, and each country is different. Some countries have already reformed, others have far to go. And it is very complicated, and there's no denying that there's a huge amount of rent seeking going on with these subsidies. So one effective way forward, perhaps linking to what Gaia have explained, is, you know, the institutional setup is very important. If your work, and what we're seeing springing up in many of these countries are new institutions that have removed the renewables side, the energy efficiency side, the biogas, taken it out of the old petroleum industries and energy ministries and set it up into something a lot more business friendly, a lot more new, and put it in a different institution. And I think, so there are some things like this that tricks, and we've seen that in Bangladesh with IDCOL, in Morocco with AMI, both of whom we've been working with on the outlines in this report from making the switch, which are very context specific. So in terms of the political economy issue, one way to do this is to shift the investments into a new area and into a new institution at the same time as doing the reforms. But it's not to say there are many difficulties, because there are, but I do think there has been progress at the country level.
All right, thank you very much. So it's not easy, but it's clearly happening, and it's got traction. I saw other requests for the floor, so if those people wanting to speak are still around, please.
Thank you. Dan Balusa from the Danish 92 Group. I think this shifting investments is definitely, like when we talk with bankers and investment, like pension funds, it's not because they are in love with fossil investments. They just like to reduce risks, and the risk seems to be very much lower, and of course partly because of subsidies. And there seems to be, like, so I would like to expand a little bit on that with the divestment investment. Like, what do you have, like, recommendations? Of course, taking away the subsidies will fix the problem, but some bridging steps towards this transition.
Right, thank you. Are there other comments or questions?
Can I just encourage women to also take part in the discussion? It bothers me as a Finnish man when it's mostly men speaking.
Okay, as I see no requests for the floor, and as I am a woman, I'll make a question. Well, Laura, you talked about in your presentation about kind of needing to be careful or doing the SWIFT sort of in a mindful manner, and you had examples about sort of switching a kerosene lighting subsidy for perhaps to a solar subsidy, and I thought that was quite interesting. So would you have practical examples about how that would have been done, where that has been done, or just really basically any other insights to that?
There were some other questions as well that weren't quite answered to. Just on this private sector interest and on why the private sector are interested. Well, coal private sector is very interested if there are coal subsidies being offered. And it can drive investment. I mean, for example, diesel manufacturers of diesel cars in Europe were quite interested in the diesel subsidies that were being offered. And look how that changed our behavior in Europe in terms of shifting all of our cars to diesel. So the I think private sector, you know, when you get down to the business of it, they are very interested in the subsidies because it will ensure, for example, their business to add up over a very number of years. For example, if they have feed-in tariffs for a wind power, they have to understand what those are to make it add up, make the investment. For energy efficiency, you know, as we've explained, it won't work for private energy efficiency investors if you're competing against diesel that's cheaper than water. There's no point investing in energy efficiency because it doesn't add up. So it's all about the pricing structure, which business well understands. And it depends on where you're sitting in the business world. Are you in a new renewable energy type of industry, or are you with the fossils? And you'll be looking at this quite carefully. And certainly in terms of reducing the risk, even the insurers now and the have been very interested about, there's a statement from insurers calling on the G20 to remove subsidies now, representing about trillions of investments. Anyway, investors care about this and insurers care about this too. So those links to the private sector are, I think private sector understand those subsidies very well. The question is, you know, that everybody's after their own rent seeking and subsidy. So it's a question of having an overall fair level playing field to make it happen. And the other thing is that, and this is also very important, even just removing the subsidies would help hugely. We're finding in Zambia that, like the other speaker question mentioned, that the cost of renewables is competitive now and doesn't need a subsidy. It doesn't necessarily need that 30% that we're suggesting for some technologies. And so really it's about just leveling the energy playing field. And then on the kerosene, you know, it's difficult because there are different types of fuels, and gasoline and diesel is an easy one. Indonesia started with that. Many do, like Morocco or Saudi. It's a regressive subsidy. It's benefiting people who drive SUVs. It's not necessarily benefiting people who don't have access to energy. But kerosene is more difficult, and I'm sure that you know, Gaia would have something to say on this as well. In terms of, you can't, for poor people, you cannot just increase prices without having in place something for them to move to, like proper solar systems to replace lighting or cooking. So it is a very difficult process, but it can be done if it's done carefully and over a number of years.
Thanks, Lara. Mikko, would you like to comment?
Thanks. Very briefly about the next steps or the bridging. We had a question about that. So we need to move on all fronts. There's no one single answer. So we need to have, of course, we need to have regulation, legislation to get the private sector involved and others to have a clear signal. The Financial Stability Board is doing great work. French new legislation could be encouraged to look and do that in other countries as well to get the private sector involved. The Danes are following very close to these things, and the Danish Climate Investment Fund is doing quite interesting work also to reduce those risks. We need to work on pressure, to get the pricing right. Even if we don't get the global carbon price soon, we know companies work on shadow pricing. This is happening, and we can ask as citizens to get that information, what kind of shadow pricing different organizations are using. And then the third point, my favorite point, Oras referred also to that, political economics. And also we need to have the right kind of language and raise awareness. And just as a concrete example, for instance, our work in Ethiopia, we work with microfinance institutions that have over 100,000 clients in different parts of the country. We connect renewable energy solutions with the finance, so that for that, based on those packages, they can move ahead and take those decisions. But on the other hand, on the central government level or in the banking sector, because they don't know what this combining microfinance and energy solutions is, so the microfinance institutions don't get sufficient funding. And this is completely crazy. So sometimes the risks maybe you refer to are just perceived risks, and we need awareness raising. Actually, in Ethiopia, those clients are more, reliable. Over 95% of them pay back. So they are great clients, but just because there is not enough awareness about things. So in some cases, we just need to clarify what are the risks and speak with the clear language to decision makers. Thanks.
Thank you. I see a lady, so if somebody could toss her a soft thing to speak to, and then there's Timo asking for the floor.
I guess I'm making the statistics of the speakers better in this room. Not only a lady, but I'm young as well. My question is more on the statistics that you use here. Like, what are the definitions of fossil fuel subsidies? Because you're talking a lot about like how much you have to pay for gas, I guess. But in Norway, I'm from Norway, I'm changemaker Norway. And in Norway, there are a lot of subsidies, or at least, yeah, we call them subsidies, but the Norwegian government doesn't like to call it subsidies. I guess you all know about this. And I'm wondering if this is included in the statistics. These are money that goes to the development or to the fossil industries to extract more oil. And I'm wondering if it's included in the statistics, and in that case, how can we use these statistics to push the Norwegian government to cut these subsidies? Because they're completely inefficient and they're not leading to this shift in energy that we need. So like how to put political pressure in using these statistics and these resources that you have given us.
Right, thank you for your question. I believe that Oras and Laura would be in position to answer, as well as Hans. So shall we start with you, Hans-Erik?
No, well, I'm not sure I'm going to ask or answer the young lady's question here, because I don't fully have that answer. But I would say on the main focus on inefficient subsidies is on consumer-related subsidies and not on the extraction or production side. And this is simply based on numbers also, because based on statistics, I think consumer-related subsidies are about 5 times higher than production subsidies. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't care, but I would say on the figures you've seen today, I think that's mainly related to consumer-related subsidies, that is bringing down the price of heat or gasoline or electricity and so forth. Yeah, I think just some general comments on the questions that has been in the room. I mean, the gentleman who now left on schizophrenic, how to say, planning of fiscal policies, and I couldn't agree more. And we see down the road the reforming of subsidies is the opportunity to address when you want to do the optimal design of your fiscal policies and bring about taxes or support schemes. So more work needs to be done on that, and I'm sure quite a lot of INDCs can be enhanced on looking at these schemes. And what you alluded to, Laura, on energy efficiency, I think it is to a wide extent getting the pricing right, so to say. We are supporting energy efficiency in big countries in Latin America. I won't mention the names now, but we are trying to do that through banks, so building capacity in banks so that they are more aware of what energy efficiency opportunities there are among their clients, so to say. But I visited one of these countries recently and I said, why are the companies not themselves asking for that? Well, that's because the electricity happens to be subsidized. So basically the cost structure of the companies doesn't really, they don't pay attention to their electricity bill because it's subsidized. And I would even say, from a Danish perspective, we say, well, we are doing quite well in energy efficiency. We have all these regulations and standards, we have voluntary agreements and so on, but when people show up and say, who paid for it? The question becomes a little bit tricky. Well, it's because we have rather high energy prices. We are not afraid of putting tax on energy. And this actually makes the business case for energy efficiency, because we are not supporting fossil fuels, but we are taxing energy use. So you will have a payback time of 2 and 3 years on energy efficiency investments. And it's when consumers or users look at the energy bill, the energy costs make a proportion of their running costs, and this is just allude to. I think the pricing issue is very important on some of these issues. And then to the gentleman here on political economy, I couldn't agree more. That I would also say, based on what subsidies you want to reform, it can become very politically sensitive, so to say. But I think just want to allude to that part of the swap model is somehow to see it as a package, so that you make governments or whoever is providing the subsidies and who are going to take them back to simultaneously think about who are your target groups, how will they be affected, and basically what compensation can you give them. And I think many reforms has been, you take the subsidies and you allocate them to social benefits that could be education or food subsidies. What we simply want to do in this focus here is to keep the subsidies within the energy system. So if we are taking subsidies for heat in Ukraine, the housing block in Ukraine should simultaneously see that they can improve in energy efficiency. So by the end of the day, it will not happen overnight, but they will improve in energy efficiency, and they will get help from these subsidies. So it's basically to close the loop, so to say, that you leave end users nearly unhurt on their energy bill. And it takes a lot of steam, we hope, out of the political economy dimension of things.
Thank you, Hans Jakob.
And maybe just one last point, because we were also asked about what are inefficient subsidies. Well, countries have subsidies based on historical reasons. They want to. We have very poor population, or for instance, in Russia, I think heat pricing is also subsidized for elderly people, because it's kind of social dimension of being a Russian. If you live in a very cold climate and you get to the 20th of October, you need to have heat in your house to survive the winter, and the government wants to support that. And in that sense, you can say it's totally politically justifiable to have these subsidies. But if you have cheaper energy efficiency technologies that can easily be provided or installed, shouldn't we take that opportunity and then take part of the subsidies and use it for these improvements? That will at least benefit the climate and lessen the reliance on fossil fuel subsidies. So we are not, shame blaming any subsidies up front, but we are convinced that there are massive opportunities out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Long but comprehensive intervention. So you can see there's variation in Nordic countries. Some of us are very short and precise, and others are capable of producing longer sentences. I think Oras wants to intervene.
I think that's a great example of the language differences between the different tribes. If I talk to an economist and ask if you think a lower tax rate on diesel is a subsidy, everyone is going to say that yes, that's a subsidy. If I talk to a politician and ask the same question, they are going to say, no, that's not a subsidy. That is a lower tax rate. And again, if you want to convince policymakers, you need to be able to communicate in their language. And I'm not sure if I have a silver bullet to convincing Norwegians on phasing out subsidies, but one way to frame it is in terms of the opportunity cost of subsidies that has been referred to earlier. If I had a meeting with a Norwegian member of parliament, I could first ask, okay, do you want to remove 1 billion Norwegian kroner of subsidies to transport fuels? And he or she is likely to answer, well, no, that doesn't sound very good. My voters would not like it. I would not be voted back in the parliament in the next round of elections. But if I rephrase the question, if I gave you 1 billion Norwegian kroner today, where would you like to invest that? And I'm going to assure you, 0% of those people would say that I would put it in fossil fuel subsidies. They would say, I would invest in healthcare, I would want to improve our schools, I would want to invest in transport infrastructure, I would want to invest in youth employment. And it's the same question, because that money is there. It's just currently being used for fossil fuel subsidies. So why not take that money and use it for something you really value as a policymaker, as an elected official?
All right, thank you. We're going to have to wrap up. So I will have one burning comment from Timo, and then we'll finish.
Please Google citizens' climate pledge. Citizens are the ones who will, in a way, finally decide how it all will proceed. So this is a Finnish initiative which we share now with UNFCCC. So when you Google it, it brings you to the UN pages and you can study. So if you find it a good idea, hey, you could please, in a way, talk about that in your own countries. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And after this commercial intervention, I want to thank everybody on the panel. I want to thank everybody in this side event. It's been a very interesting discussion. And I also have a commercial. If you have the time and if you thought this was a helpful side event, please go and rate the side event at the UNFCCC webpage. Thank you very much. There should be food and drinks outside.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm from Iran. So, we are subsidies for it. So, I will not call you for and I will keep my card. And you, I'm from Iran. And I can put you. And we need yours. We need yours.
We want the stuff so we can around 10 years ago. So we can also help
I don't have my card, but I can